Hello, BookTube. We're continuing on with only the second mandatory read-along in the history of this channel. That is The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. His 1859 book that changed the world, that changed certainly the whole map of science as it was known, all the biological sciences until then, but also everything else as well, religion, society. This book was dropped as a very mild-mannered and soft-spoken bombshell into the intellectual world of everyone who had existed at the time by taking lots of strands that had been around, not only in Victorian science, but also in ancient times, about gradual change in the world and bringing them all together in a theory of evolution by means of natural selection, in which populations change over geological time by varying their genetic material, because every single living thing that's born is not a perfect copy. It's not a perfect genetic copy of its progenitors. There are always genetic variations, and most of them are nothing, and most of them are not visual, and most of them don't have anything to do with the environment, but every once in a while one will have an advantage in the environment, will give a small advantage. And if it gives a small advantage, that advantage might be enough for its possessor to pass on their genes to the next generation, where the ones who don't have that small generation maybe don't. It's a very slow, very incremental process. But to give you an example, let's say a human example. You have a human example where, let's say your climate is changing. Okay, let's say you're entering a period of glaciation. So the winters are longer and the winters are harder. Summers are shorter and a little more violent and look like they'd be going away forever. And you have enough subsistence to live on, but you are vulnerable to the cold. And since humans evolved in Africa, we're not covered in fur. So we're vulnerable to the cold. Let's say that you have, certain members of one generation of a population that has a slightly greater amount of subcutaneous fat, a slightly greater amount of stored fat tissue. They're going to have a small advantage in an environment that's getting colder. And that advantage may allow them to pass that advantage on in ways that people who are more vulnerable to the cold don't have. So that way down the line, you get people who are better adapted to the cold. We see it happen in populations that we ourselves manipulate by taking the place of geological time and accelerating the whole process with selective breeding. And it was Darwin's jump to say, well, if humans can do that with selective breeding, then what can a vast amount of time and the natural world plus our own rates of mutation do without any intention? That's what made this book a bombshell. Darwin knew that perfectly well. The thing he knew perfectly well was that he was introducing a worldview in which everything that exists in the natural world could have gotten here without anyone trying to make it get there. Evolution by means of natural selection is a blind process. The genetic, no matter what the X-Men might tell you, the genetic improvement, the genetic variation, the one I talked about that has slightly greater retention of subcutaneous fat deposits, was an accident. It's just the only reason that it became a trait or whatnot is because it was built on over time, because it happened to fit the environment. And by the same token, that process can work against you. Polar bears, for instance, are perfectly adapted to Arctic conditions and not adapted to non-Arctic conditions. They aren't grizzly bears. If their environment, their polar environment, were to change very quickly, that being the key here is the geological passages of time. If it changes very quickly, they're doomed, absolutely doomed. And we've seen that happen many, many times. Many, many other animals, or even if the change in the environment is human. Think of what's the most famous extinction of them all, right? The dodo, the passenger pigeon. If non-geologic, non-enormous passages of time weren't necessary, if evolution could happen very quickly, then dodos would have learned to hide their eggs. Passenger pigeons would have learned different migration routes or nighttime migration. It doesn't happen that way, so it can work against an organism as well. And Darwin knew that. And in this book, in the chapters that we're reading today, he mentions that most people don't take sufficient account of that. He writes, on the sudden appearance, this is a subtitle, a subsection, on the sudden appearance of whole groups of allied species. The abrupt manner in which whole groups of species suddenly appear in certain formations has been urged by several paleontologists as a fatal objection to the belief in the transmutation of species. If numerous species belonging to the same genera or families have really started into life all at once, the fact would be fatal to the theory of descent with slow modification through natural selection. For the development of a group of forms, all of which have descended from some one progenitor, must have been an extremely slow process, and the progenitors must have lived long ages before their modified descendants. But we continually overrate the perfection of the geological record, and falsely infer, because certain genera and families have not been found beneath a certain stage, that they did not exist before that stage. We continually forget how large the world is compared with the area over which our geological formations have been carefully examined. We forget that groups of species may elsewhere have long existed and have slowly multiplied before they invaded an ancient archipelagos of Europe or of the United States. We do not make due allowance for the enormous intervals of time which have probably elapsed between our consecutive formations. That is a great thing to stress, because it's a fault that people have even today. People who might object to the theory of evolution, or who might not like it on aesthetic or religious grounds, will often founder on the sheer amount of time involved. It's, I think, one of the visceral attractions of young Earth creationism is that people think, well, my mind can't really conceive 1,000,000 years, much less 1,000,000,000 years. I'm more comfortable with 6,000 years. But that's not how it works, and it's neat that Darwin foresees that, and many other objections. He spends most of the chapters that we're reading in this read-along defending against objections, either real or imagined, things that he's either heard from other professionals or that he's come up with himself, things that would falsify his theory. And I think he effectively parries every one of them. I'm going to keep this read-along brief, but we're going to finish this up next week. We're reading 100 pages a week. So, of course, as usual, I'm curious to know what you're making of all this, most especially in addition to all of the scientific stuff and the clarity of Darwin's thought. Are you enjoying the prose? I'm enjoying the prose a lot in this read-along. I always love reading Darwin, but this book especially seems more readable. Some of you have mentioned that you've read other books by his, like The Descent of Man, or that sort of thing, and that they aren't anywhere near as readable. I agree with that completely. This and The Voyage of the Beagle are Darwin writing for a general audience in very winning terms. It reminds me, his turn of phrase, his turn of thought reminds me a lot of Melville in a lot of ways. I don't know why that is. But I'm curious to know what you make of the portions that we're reading today, and we'll just barrel on next week. We're going to finish our second mandatory read-along next week. So I will wrap this up for now, but I'll be back. Thank you, Book 2.